So we are good to go. I'm going to turn that camera on. This one's going to stay off for now. Same thing with your microphones. I'll turn those on once we get to the conversation. Okay, good. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm an event facilitator here at Nállim Robinson Booksellers. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabeg, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and the Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Red River Métis. Additionally, as well, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. And of course, we are gathered to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Strangely Friends, a history of Cuban-Canadian encounters by Karen Dubinsky. And many thanks are due both to her publisher, Between the Lines, and to the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba in support of this evening. And you'll be hearing from Karen shortly when she joins Jorge and Nállim in a conversation on Cuban-Canadian encounters through music, art, politics, and more. And following the conversation, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you are here today and you do have a question, just raise your hand enough for me to see you, and I'll come by with this microphone. That's only to ensure that you're heard on tonight's live stream for the cameras over here for folks who are watching at home. And I will be back at the end of the event just to review a signing procedure at the end, exactly like that. But for now, of course, I have the pleasure of introducing Jorge, Jorge A. Nállim, full name there. Professor of History at the University of Manitoba to kick off the evening. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much all for being here. This is a great night, fun night for us to be here for this book launch. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Dubinsky, Karen, for us in this presentation. Dr. Dubinsky is a historian who until recently taught in the Department of Global Development Studies and History at Queen's University. In addition to the book that we are going to be discussing today, she has published and edited 9 other books on a wide variety of topics, including the history of gender and sexuality in Canada, the global 1960s, adoption and child migration in Canada, Cuba and Guatemala, and the politics of music in Cuba. She has also co-edited 2 anthologies about Canada and the world. So she's a decorated, well-published historian. Her interest in Cuba also led her to write Cuba Beyond the Beach, Stories of Life in Havana, that we also see here in the table. Also, her new book that we're going to present and discuss today is Strangely Friends, A History of Cuban-Canadian Encounters. In addition, I should add that Karen has also co-taught and coordinated a university exchange program on Cuban culture, which brought Canadian students to the University of Havana and Cuban artists and academics to Canada. She's also co-host of Cuban Serenade, a podcast about Cuban musicians in Canada, and she hosts also the radio program Cuban Sounds in Canada. So let us all welcome Karen, and then we'll go on to that. Okay, before we go, the way how we're going to do this is a conversation about the book. I just want to make a few remarks about the book in general, and we go from there. I think that the book, as a Latin Americanist, is a welcome and refreshing contribution to 2 different bodies of literature on Cuba in general. Especially first regarding the historiography on Cuba and the Cuban Revolution and its aftermath. Traditionally, this has been looked at in a very polarized manner, you know, in the media, not only in academic circles, but in the media. People would talk, or scholars would discuss it as a kind of the tropical gulag, you know, a communist nightmare, hellish. And then you have the opposite extreme, right? The Cuban paradise, right? The tropical paradise of a revolutionary and egalitarian society. More recent scholarship has provided more nuances on this, but still in the media, it's very common, you know, to listen to this kind of, especially the tropical gulag, you know, kind of stereotype. It's very common still today. The other contribution that the book makes is to the literature on Canadian relations with Latin America in general and Cuba in particular. Again, there has been tradition, not a lot of literature on Canadian, Cuban, or Canadian Latin American relations because it has been overshadowed by the huge amount of books on US Latin American relations, right? For obvious reasons, because the US intervened for so many years and so long, and it still does in Latin America. Again, we have growing a number of books and scholars are writing about Canadian Latin American relations and specifically Canadian Cuban relations. So what strangely friends contribute is first a perspective that transcends easy labels and dichotomies. It's a book about a dynamic relationship between two countries, the relationship that is marked by collaboration as well as misunderstandings. And second, and more important, the analysis goes beyond the nation state to take a look at what Karen labels people-to-people diplomacy. So she thus argues in page 4, quote, to consider international relations only from the top state level overlooks the friendships and personal ties that exist in people-to-people relations and informal diplomacies by non-state actors, end of quote. And therefore, from these beginnings, from this first argument, the book proceeds to explore the ties created by multiple people from the earliest 20th century up to now. So musicians, teachers, students, people involved in development projects, and tourists all parade through the pages of the book, showing the deep ties that were built below the broader foreign policy between both countries. Readers are going to find fascinating characters, from Kit Coleman, the journalist that covered the Spanish-American War of 1898, to the Quebecois priest Marie Bertrand, who collected plants and did questionable research on young Cuban girls and women, to a young Leonard Cohen caught in Havana in the middle of the US-sponsored invasion of the Bay of Pigs in 1961. But to add more nuances and depth, this is not just a book of Canadians in Cuba, but also about Cubans in Canada, something that provides a true transnational dimension to each story in the book and to the overall story. So we are shown here a plethora of Cuban students and musicians in Canada throughout the years, and showing how they adapted, you know, to the environment and how they interacted and they were transformed by their experiences here in Canada, very much as those Canadians going to Cuba. If nothing else, this book should be of interest to every Canadian, as we all know, and Karen analyzes, that Canadians represented traditionally a disproportionately large percentage of tourists to Cuba. While many go to enjoy beaches and good time, many others, as the book explored, move from their tourist experiences to build more meaningful and direct experiences with Cuban people. Numbers have certainly dropped because of the pandemic and the current crisis in Cuba, but before pandemic, it was estimated 1 million Canadians per year went to Cuba. So, and they represent the largest amount of tourists in Cuba, by and large. So, the book showed that below tourism, there's a long history of relationships that goes back in history. So this is a brief description. So with this now, we can go to talk about the book, it has been a pleasure reading the book. I strongly recommend it to all of you. So I would like to pose some questions to Karen so she can expand on some of the topics that I found interesting. I think that it will be of interest for all of us. The first question is that Some books have an exclusive scholarly focus, right? To research a new topic or understudied topic, to deploy new methodological frameworks. Others draw more in from a more personal perspective, right? And this book seems to be kind of both, right? You are, on the one hand, studying these Canadian-Cuban relations, but also at a more personal level, but you clearly saw yourself as part of the story of the book. So I'd like you to comment a little bit more, if you can tell us, what led you to write this book?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being such an incredibly attentive reader. You really, this is the second time we've had a conversation, and I'm really touched in this era of, you know, we read so quickly on our phones, and you are the classic deep reader. So thank you for that. That shouldn't be such a great thing, but it is a great thing. These days, it's a great thing. And thank you everybody for coming. 10 years ago, I wrote another book on Cuba, and Adele Perry said to me, "You've got to come to Winnipeg. Winnipeg is a book launch town, and look at this audience on a Friday night in this incredibly cool bookstore at the beginning of the World Series." So thank you for coming. I wrote this. I was motivated to write this book, as you know, because of my experiences for about 15 years, 15 to 18, depending on how you count the pandemic, taking students, organizing a course at Queen's that was taught by me and a colleague, different colleagues over the time, but mostly Susan Lord, a film scholar, and then bringing 20 to 30 to 35, so one year we almost hit 40 students with us to the University of Havana, where our instructors were academics, but also we were able to really push the envelope there and go see, go hear from musicians and go to theaters and hear from playwrights and a lot of filmmakers as well. Not to mention all of the learning that took place, between 9 or before 9 and certainly after 5, when the students ran around the then and still, but less so now, incredibly safe, easy city for a bunch of 20-year-old, mostly white kids who had mostly non-Spanish speaking, who had barely, if they had been to Cuba at all before, they had been in the resorts of Veraderos, which were like, daycare centers for them. And I still can, with two of us, 2 adults there, and often other, colleagues or other adults who came along, but and nothing bad happened. The kinds of things that you would expect might happen in any big city, in any part of the world. So that was pedagogy like you wouldn't believe. That was amazing pedagogy. But I also got to see up close that foreign policy is not the preserve of presidents and prime ministers and ministers of external affairs. This coincided with an acknowledgement and a realization of that fact in the scholarly world, that there's now all kinds of literature on the role played, the diplomatic role, sometimes again a small d diplomatic role played by tourists, by missionaries, by sports figures, food studies. There's a million. In fact, as I was working on this book, I taught a course for a few years called Foreign Policy Without States, where we looked at the kinds of diplomatic initiatives that were taking place all over the world in different realms. So that's why I guess I tried to keep it a combination of scholarly in the sense of based on research, based on archives, based on books, certainly based on a lot of interviews. I think I interviewed about 150 people for the book, but it was also the story that I had lived for many years as an instructor there. And I took, some people say that all history is at some level autobiographical or has an autobiographical kernel in it. This was definitely more than a kernel for me. It was really, it was fascinating, in a certain way comforting to me, as I was getting more and more comfortable in the city of Havana, in that world, figuring things out, improving my Spanish, making good friends, all of that kind of stuff, having professional and personal relationships with people, but still mostly at the end of every day, stumbling around and feeling really confused, because it's a confusing place. It's a really confusing place. And this, you know, even though earlier generations had more certainties about the revolution than I had, certainties about what was going on in Cuba. I was really comforted, I guess I will stay with that word, to see the kinds of experiences people had in the early, in the late 50s, early 60s, who came to Cuba immediately after the revolution to do support kinds of work. The people who came later, who were educators, who came, you know, to help train Cuban engineers and all kinds of other programs. There had been a long history of people like me who were not government representatives, who were not there for explicitly political reasons. We have political opinions, but it wasn't solidarity in the sense that a lot of people went and still do. It was more other kinds of relationships that that bear talking about, and in fact, plenty of them.
It's interesting. We share that experience of being in this disorienting place, as we have talked and exchanged our stories. I led a study abroad programs on Sarah Lawrence College in New York before coming to Manitoba. So we share a lot of anecdotes about being in Cuba, which even for me, that I'm an Argentinian, but, so I could speak fluent Spanish or that, but leading a group of Americans, nothing less, you know, into Cuba in 2005. Yeah, it was quite something. It was 2 hurricanes, you know, and we go from there. Anyways, so indeed, and I think that going to from what you said also, you cover a wide range of voices here in the book and experiences, from former Cuban students in Canadian universities to tourists, NGO, people who work in NGOs, committed revolutionaries, people who are sympathetic to the revolution, musicians. So how did you choose? How did you choose? What oriented your selection? Are there why you chose? Why did you choose some voices and not others? Did you leave others?
Yeah. I had, and anyone in this room that's written a thesis, written a book, written anything will know that you start out with ridiculously ambitious plans, and usually you have to leave things on the cutting room floor if you even get to the point where you have things for the cutting room floor. I had ideas about business relationships, and I actually went to a trade fair in Havana and interviewed a bunch of Canadian business people, which was fascinating, but just became too big. Oh, plus the pandemic hit right in the middle of all this. So that also caused me to pare it down. So I didn't, you know, business relationships, sports relationships, there's plenty of other possibilities. Tourism being another one. I chose educational ties and musical ties and the NGO world. Not because I think they're the most important, not because I gave them higher priority necessarily. They were in front of me, really. The person that opened this door to me was a woman by the name of Adrienne Hunter, who I met actually at the Havana International Book Fair when I was there promoting the Cuba Beyond the Beach book. And this wonderful woman comes up to me after a talk like this and says, hello, and this is like 2016, maybe 15. She says, hello, I'm Canadian. I've been here since 1972. I think you should talk to me. I think you might like to talk to me. So I went to her house the next day, and she had been one of the translators, the English teachers who accompanied this group of engineering professors in the early 70s, who literally, as development projects go, it was amazingly successful in the sense that it did what it intended to do, and you can't always say that in the development studies world. It helped to create an engineering program, a university there called Cuhai, which still exists, and I was able to interview some of the beneficiaries, so to speak, of that program, who were engineering profs. So she told me about that program because it was a government-funded program, Canadian government-funded program by CUSO, Canadian University Services Overseas. It had a paper trail, so there's a huge archive in Ottawa of CUSO. So that spoke for itself. CUSO was the first NGO, foreign NGO, invited into Cuba since the revolution. There had been plenty of other advisors from Eastern European countries, other Latin American countries, but this was the first non-governmental organization. And so that because I guess that's that's maybe the way historians are often led, by the archives, right? The education stuff was kind of obvious because that was the world that I was living in, and I just found all kinds of examples of Canadian students in Cuba, the kind of curriculum the Cuban students get about Canada in the formal education system. And then music was a no-brainer because I fell in love with Cuban music and have never recovered from that and never intend to. And the pandemic, I have to say, also helped with that one because everybody was stuck at home, and one of my former students who's in Winnipeg working this year at a conference, and he may walk in the door, so I'll tell you about him in case he does. Freddie Monasterio, he did a PhD on Cuban music in Cuba. We'd worked together for a while. He came up with the bright idea. He was living in Toronto then. He said, everybody's at home, let's just start interviewing musicians. So we started, that's where the podcast came from, actually, is we just started interviewing people, and I realized that I had talked to people for, kind of for the book, but it was this long repeated conversations we got to have with people because everybody was home, that made me realize how interesting musicians are off the stage as well as on the stage, the kinds of conversations that we had.
This is so fascinating. I can imagine as a historian the excitement when some person comes and tells you, I have been here since 1972, yeah. And like, oh my God. Then you have the evidence walking to you, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah.
How cool is that? Yeah. So, and another thing that appears, and I think I'll come back later to the question of Curso, because I think that is a really interesting project. But a recurring theme in the book is how both Canadians and Cubans dealt with their prejudices and misconceptions, right? So there are misunderstandings on both sides, right? Canadian tourists, or not only tourists, but Canadians in general, look at Cuba many times as a tropical paradise for someone. Many look at that through the good revolutionary lens, it's a version of the good savage, but the good revolution and the clean revolution happening there. Others go with a white savior perspective and going to help poor Cubans, well-intentioned, but they're still with that kind of white good savior. But on the Cuban side also, there are all sorts of misconceptions, stereotypes, there were suspicions that appear here in the book about Canadians as foreigners with double intentions in Cuba in the context of the Cold War and the United States and so on. Well, who are these the English-speaking people in Havana, for example, what are you doing there? Other Cubans saw Canadians as a source of hard currency, which is still the case if you go in tourism to Cuba. Or there's just imagination about Canada as this kind of first world country, right? Pure, untouched, and so on. So my question for you is how, if you could expand, how people and institutions navigated these perceptions, this miscommunication?
Yeah, that's such a big question. I think one of the things I guess I would start with and come back to constantly is, I got this from reading Edward Said, but you could get this also from plain old, in a certain way, plain old common sense, one of the requirements, one of the things that's necessary to have meaningful relationships across the vast differences that are people in Canada and people in Cuba is self-awareness. And I mean, that also came, I think, from being there as a teacher, being there with, you know, as I said, 20-year-old Canadians, mostly 20-year-old Canadian students who had rarely left home or certainly had not been on their own in a big city. And self-awareness and the ability to, you know, think honestly about one's own position vis-a-vis somebody else is always, I think, necessary to form any kind of relationship. But when there's somebody else, when you're positioned so differently economically, et cetera, who's there, who has a plane ticket, and who needs a visa, and who all of those kind of really basic questions, that really, that I think influenced relationships right from the beginning. There was a story, one of my favorite examples of this is a story told to me by a Cuban filmmaker named Juan Padron, who was friends with a lot of those early, the Canadians who were there to help teach engineering and help set up that program. And he was, you know, he was their age. He was then starting out his film career. He was actually working as a journalist. So he was hanging out with his friends. He was hanging out with people his own age. Every once in a while, he would get brought up short where the differences would reveal themselves. And the one he chose to use to tell me about, which I use as my example, he's sitting there in early 1970s Cuba, and one of his pals from CUSO is at his house. They're hanging out, they're doing whatever, and no, vice versa. He's at the friend's house, and the friend opens a can of tuna and feeds it to his cat. And this happened in 1972, and I'd been talking to Juan Padron in 2018, and he still summoned up all this emotion, like a country that was undergoing food scarcity, that had food rationing, and he's feeding tuna to his cat, and I can still remember him, how can you believe that? And so those are the self-reflection and self-awareness doesn't change different economic, and it's not only economic, but I'll use economic as the sort of shorthand for inequalities, doesn't change that. But if you have that, right, if you really consider yourself in relation to, and that obviously that works on both sides, that allows the door to open for more meaningful kinds of conversations. On the Cuban side, there was definitely people from various different eras told me that often they felt like they kind of hit a wall with Cubans who were hit some kind of wall, that Cubans had a kind of sometimes had a suspicion of foreigners that would logically have come from a government that had a suspicion of some foreigners, most especially foreign. I'll say foreign governments, but you know, those are difficult to parse. A fear of a government or a suspicion of a government versus people. It's not always easy to see the difference. I think that varied by sector. People in the cultural communities, in arts and music, told me, no, nobody worried about hanging around with foreigners. When the first friend that I had, the first sort of research colleague who became a friend that I had was someone in the film world. She was a film scholar. She was helping me look through some film archives for another project I was doing before this. We got to be friends. She would come to where I was. I would go to her house. We met each other's families, blah, blah, blah. After several visits, one time she said to me, you know, when you leave, and I think I was getting ready to leave, she said, you know, when you leave, my neighbors are going to call the cops on me. And I went, what? And she said, nah, I'm just messing with you. But 10 years ago, that might have happened. So I think I was kind of on the end of I was definitely on the end of that kind of very local level fear and suspicion. And that's the only, I mean, it literally never came up in my relations. It only came up as a joke, but it's a joke that was instructive.
It's interesting because inequalities play out in so many different ways, right? And also from my experience as you know,
Yeah.
being a male in Cuba, foreigner with money, obviously, right? So that created a lot of immediate inequalities, right? About I had money, and there were a lot of assumptions about that, right? So there are gender and race, there are all sorts of things that complicate relations. So it's very interesting how these different people were able to navigate in different ways, right? Some of them reaffirming, some other challenging.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the case of Curso, that interesting program that you were talking about, the Canadian University Service Overseas program, or Curso in the 1970s, which is the first NGO program allowed back in Cuba after the revolution. Right, it's a program that, despite all these issues of miscommunication, it was able to build some extraordinary collaboration. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, because it's really extraordinary in the literature development, or even the literature between inequalities between Canada and Cuba. How were they able to do that kind of program?
It's I love that. I say to myself sometimes, who would have ever thought that I would get so excited by and interested in and really into this very technical scientific engineering exchange, because that's totally not my world. And in fact, I didn't, if you had asked me to explain what they did, I couldn't tell you. They taught engineering, you know, that's what they did. But they taught engineering to a country that was, I always remember this line from the archives from one of the project leaders. This is a country that's committed to development, like this, and that wasn't like in the Ministry of Development, blah. This was so from the ground up, so from the bottom up, and they had a really strong sense, and I think continue to. I can't really speak for right now in terms of the development world. But certainly at the beginning, from the 60s through to the 90s, a really strong sense of what the country needed. The country needed technical expertise, needed educational help. The country did not need hundreds, if not thousands, of kids tripping over themselves, doing good work, not speaking Spanish, not having any particular skills. They really did not. They had a vision of development that, and I say this as somebody who taught for 15 years in a development studies program, who you know, we were helping to churn out those kids tripping over each other in running all over the world. And I realize that sounds disrespectful, and I shouldn't be so disrespectful about the personnel, because the impulses are great, are really good. But when I see the difference between the way development was conceptualized and practiced in the early case of Cuba, and a lot of the NGO people with who I was able to interview, you know, the previous ones and the ones who were there more or less these days, it's difficult for them to work in Cuba because there's really strict rules about how many people and where the offices are and what you can do and but most of them support it because they think that's better development practice. You know, you don't need to hire a whole bunch of Canadians to do this. You train people there to do it, and that's kind of the whole point. So I think, frankly, I think that's why that works so well.
It's very interesting, yes, because indeed it's not for what you tell and the stories that participants tell about this program. It's extraordinary in the sense that Cubans were very clear, we want this, right? And Canadians agreed to that below the level of the state and achieving a degree of collaboration at the horizontal level that is very rare, especially in this period of developmental programs, right? So it's quite an interesting story about showing that possibility. The other thing that I would like you to talk a little bit more is that the shadow of the US-Cuban relationship looms large in the book, right? How did it shape that kind of relationship, the possibilities and the limits of Canadian-Cuban encounters at the personal level? That kind of threatening presence right there?
Certainly the economic blockade meant that Canadians were more, I'll say, more conscious of material aid and one of the bringing stuff, and in a way that I don't think Canadian tourists going to Jamaica or going to wherever people go, I don't think they pack vitamins. They don't, it's not the same situation by any means, I don't think. And so that created the opportunity for white saviorism, for sure. And I didn't really study tourism. There is somebody, a colleague at McMaster, who is studying tourism and has done some initially really good work, trying to get at the what's in the mindset of the Canadians who are involved, who are tourists who continually go back to the same resort and bring stuff. And there's that's not necessarily at all a quote unquote white savior activity, not at all. But that's one example I would think of. It creates, and ironically, tragically, sadly, one of my favorite characters, so to speak, was a Cuban-born Canadian. His dad was the manager of the Bank of Nova Scotia. He was in Havana. Obviously before the revolution. Harry Tanner grew up in Cuba. The revolution happens. His dad and of course the bank leaves. Harry is 20 years old and he goes, I think there's some interesting things happening here. I'd like to stay. And so he does for decades. He becomes a filmmaker and a painter and super interesting guy. His painting is the cover of the book, I'm happy to say. He also, of course, continued a correspondence with his family back in Toronto. And in his correspondence, which is a kind of this amazing Canadian window from a Canadian kid's youth perspective on the cultural life of Cuba, he also includes, every letter includes a shopping list. Would you bring me? And I'm reading through the shopping list that Harry Tanner sent his dad through the 60s and 70s. And it's kind of the same shopping list that I know, that my students know, that Cubans know among themselves. And so it's a feature that I think, for me, it's a feature, like, as I said, beyond, it's not about white savior, it's about friendship, right? It's about friendship.
Indeed. The last two chapters of the book are pretty much focused on music, right? Exchanges around music. Canadians go into Cuba for music, to enjoy music, but also to perform, to learn music, as well as Cuban musicians in Canada, right? And this seems to have been, in your account, one incredible place for opportunities for exchanges, collaborations, transnational movements, and adaptations of people in different contexts. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this aspect of music and why music and not other arts, for example? Right?
Because I love music, because I love Cuban music. One could write similarly, I think, about film. And in fact, there's a Cuban scholar who's now teaching at the University of Montreal, who came, she was actually our translator for the course, and then she came to study in Canada, and she studied with us at Queen's, and she now has a regular job at the University of Montreal, and she is a Cuban film expert, and she has been working a lot on Cuban-Canadian film collaborations, of which there are plenty, actually. Why music? I think, as I said, I first fell in love with the sounds, you know, as one does with music, and then the musical culture of the country is very different from the musical culture here. There is music everywhere. Concerts used to, you know, in the good old days, concerts cost about $1 to get into. It's very easy. Music is everywhere, and audiences are educated. I used to say to our students this to try to illustrate the difference. Cuba is the only place I know when a child comes up to the parent and says, "I've got it figured out, I'm gonna be a musician when I grow up," the parents go, "Hooray, what a great idea," as opposed to here, which is, "Come on, what do you really do? You're gonna go bankrupt, don't be ridiculous." Then Freddie and I had the experience of interviewing so many musicians, Cuban musicians here, and that's where I realized that there's just such a rich way of thinking about music, but also it was teaching me things about immigration in Canada. And so I like it so much, I'm working on a next project, interviewing Cuban and Cuban adjacent musicians, getting out of the little part of the country that I was in, which was Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa. And of course, there's plenty of musicians there, but there are also Cuban musicians and Cuban sounds on the East Coast. I did some interviews this summer on the West Coast. And in fact, in Winnipeg, I was able to come early and see Papa Mambo play Buena Vista Social Club tribute on the weekend, and interview Rodrigo Muñez himself, who I'm so happy to see here. And so I've interviewed Cuban adjacent musicians in Winnipeg, and hope to do more. So that's there's a lot. It's a lot to learn from listening to musicians speak as well as play.
And the story is full of examples of Cubans who come here to Canada, and some really fascinating passages how they have to adapt their music, right? So it's too loud, so you have to put fewer people on the stage. You have to change the rhythm. People don't dance. Okay, they don't dance. How could that be? Well, they don't dance. They just don't dance, right? And this is something that they constantly mention, right? It's so different from Cuba, where people, it's there. It's in the spirit of the people.
I heard from the stage on Saturday, I heard Amber Epp say something I've never heard said from a stage. And honest to God, every musician I think I've spoken to in this country has something to say about Canadian hesitance or reticence about dancing. Amber Epp said something like, "Okay, you can dance to this. This is going out to all the Mennonites out there. If I can do it, so can you." So she she owned it and turned it around, and it was brilliant. It was really brilliant. Another Cuban, I'll tell you this story because I also love this response. A pianist from Holguin who I interviewed in Halifax, I said, and the dancing, what about the dancing? He said, "I don't give a shit if they don't dance, I dance."
And remind me of the time. I have just a final question, and it will open for questions from the audience. And it's about Manitoba and Winnipeg, right? As you said, you were interviewing now. And you described a very interesting case under the Canadian World Youth Program, right? The reciprocal exchange program that operated between 1995 and 2004. The program paired one Canadian and one Cuban student living together in rural areas. Half a year in Canada, and then they went half a year to Cuba, which is quite unique, right? So not the big cities, just rural areas. It's a fascinating example of this kind of transnationalism, this kind of collaborations. And you mentioned at some point students who came here to Manitoba, and they went to visit indigenous reserves, right? And the shock of the Cubans what is this, right? Because again, perceptions of Canada as first world country, and then the reality that we know about the situation. And then that even Canadians were shocked by that, because obviously many Canadian students have not gone to those parts of the country or the province. So they were kind of shocked by that. So I think that kind of program shows also the depth and the possibilities and the tensions that were open, by these exchanges you were describing.
Yeah.
So Manitoba is an interesting case. We have Brandon is more than 10% Central American and Mexican population these days because of all the foreign workers, migrant workers that come here. So there's a lot of people there. We have a colleague there, Patricia Harms, a historian who works also with the migrant labor population there. There are more and more Central American and Mexicans also coming to different towns here in Manitoba. So it's part of this transnational migration. So that might open in the future more grounds for this kind of research.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That, I have to say that program, I'm blanking on the name, Adele, what's the name of the organization?
The Canadian World.
Canada World Youth, thank you. That I know Adele Perry also participated in a long time ago. That was one of the most reciprocal education exchanges that I had ever heard of and have ever heard of. I found out very little. I interviewed, there's a couple of books, and I interviewed somebody who was one of the instructors, who's now a professor at the University of Alberta. So I tried to get access to their archives to no avail. I tried to find some of the participants, because apparently they created ties, you know, when they were 18 that continue, but I had no luck getting into it. But there's definitely more research to be done. Our program, you know, we send 20, 30 students, we brought, not send, and we were able to invite one scholar or filmmaker or musician. We have worked with, I guess, over time, four Cuban graduate students who came to study with us, but that was an individual thing that nobody set that up. So there is a notable lack of reciprocity in what we call educational exchanges.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. We're going to open now to questions from the audience. Daniel, are you there?
Oh yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's, any question from the audience?
I don't have necessarily a question, but I do have a comment about the dance. Because we've been privileged to go back and forth to Cuba and Havana. We don't go to the beaches. But if you've ever been to a school concert here and go to a school concert there, where the students in music are performing, everybody is dancing. It is truly amazing because they just feel the music. And the question of loud, we had a group here, Grupo Moncada. Years ago, we were setting up at Winnipeg Beach, and somebody came over and said, I hope the music's not too loud. And Roberto said, what is loud? It's just amazing.
Question?
No question?
Don't be shy.
So this is not to know the right buttons. That's exciting. Yeah. So this was such a great conversation. It was just such a pleasure to listen. You guys should have like a talk show where you would like go around and be like Jorge and Karen on all sorts of things.
A podcast.
There we go.
Yeah, perhaps. But I guess I'm also just thinking of this, thinking of Jorge's mentioning of some of the work you've done before this, and I just wonder where this fits within, you know, your work as a feminist scholar of all sorts of things, including sort of history and gender and sexuality in Canada. Where because I see it as a fit, but I just wonder if maybe you can talk a little more about that.
I mean, I usually think that I took this opportunity to work in Cuba was a turn for me, and I am not trained as a Cuban scholar. I'm not trained as an Americanist. I learned Spanish as I was on the go, you know, as I was working. I was influenced by the Adele Perrys of the world that were thinking about Canadian history in a more open and transnational way. That definitely opened my mind a bit, a lot actually, not a bit. But sometimes I was very keenly aware of what I was not, that I was not, well, I was not Cuban, but that wasn't the main thing. I was not trained as a, and you know, PhDs are all, we're all very obsessed with what our little sandbox is, right? Too obsessed sometimes. But I was keenly aware of my limitations in terms of, I don't know the Cuban archives. I didn't take a million courses in Latin American history. I took 0 courses in Latin American history. So I was very much self-taught. And so I think one of the things that I found, one of the reasons that I don't know, enjoyed so much working on this book is that I felt like I was on firmer ground because this was about Canada and Cuba and Canada. The previous book on Havana was far less of an attempt to be a scholarly book, and some of the work that I did on musicians, I did in collaboration with Cuban colleagues. And so I guess I do, of course, I do have some of that historians or academic sense of stay in your lane. Not much anymore, but I still have some of that, like respect your training and, you know, obviously respect the place you're going to study. You can't just kind of pop in and say, now, you know, now I know everything because I've been here for 10 minutes. So it definitely did feel like a turn, but it was a turn that I was really willing to make because I had collaborative relations with Cuban colleagues, both there and here.
Thanks for that great talk. This is fascinating.
I have to say Julie and Seth were 2 of the grown-ups that came along with us to Cuba a couple of times, and their presence was appreciated.
It was amazing. It was amazing. It was amazing to be with those Queens kids, those like mostly privileged Queens kids. And, you know, in downtown Havana, and memorable moments, like the almost mugging and so on, right? Very drunk kids. I guess my question is about how would you imagine, how do you sort of foresee these encounters changing as the political situation in Cuba, you know, has become like, you know, there's this whole trajectory, right, of sort of opening up, and then more recently, it's closing down, it's becoming much more repressive and so on. So I think what you've cataloged here is a lot of these sort of the high point, right? Sort of the open and exciting moments, but things are changing. And I guess if you could say more about that, I think that would be interesting.
There still are education exchanges. There's still, believe it or not, there's still American programs, still American programs. And I would say even now, because some of the instructors are people I know and I follow them, and so I see that they're in Havana. Who knows how, you know, that could be daily, you know, the thing that who knows how long that stuff is going to last. It's a far different city than it was, even when you guys were there. People are more desperate. There is more crime. There is more, you know, I'll just leave it like that. I'm having a hard time imagining doing it the way that we were able to do it, with relative ease and certainly relative security. On the other hand, it remains, to me, an incredibly fascinating place, despite you know, and I'm not speaking so much in terms of tourism, but more, and you know, people who go, and there are people who go, of course, all the time, and who also see the changes and also have long-time relationships with friends there who can narrate that much better than I can. And I think also there's, even though on the cultural side, there is still International Film Festival in December. There is still an International Jazz Festival in January, which is a really, really awesome thing. There are fewer state-run clubs for various reasons. There are way more private clubs. So guess what? There's still music. There's still lots of cultural. Havana remains a very cultured place. there are fewer Cubans at those events because there are such problems with public transportation, there are such problems with money and with food security and all of that, you know, with daily life. When daily life is this tough, do you go to a bar in the evening, even if it is nearby, and even if there's amazing music there? So I have certainly noticed those kind of things, the cultural life. The material life is, of course, also incredibly difficult, and the power grid keeps collapsing, and you know, all of the problems that people, if you follow Cuba even a little bit, you know what kind of economic problems there are. A lot of people also have left. I mean, you know, 10% I think have left, including lots of musicians. One of the great things about the Jazz Festival is that it remains a kind of a meeting point for Cubans who are there, Cubans resident in Cuba, and Cubans from the diaspora, and musicians from literally all over the world. So it's a little taste of the culture that used to be. You didn't need to have a jazz festival to get that kind of vibrant music before.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more quick question over here.
Well, first, just a quick observation, or just wondering, based on what Adele said, I was reminded, Margaret Randall, Cuban Women Now, there's this connection. Sorry, I'm old enough to. I don't know whether I still have my coffee, so there has been this interest in Cuba, in your Stephen Kimber's book about the Cuban Five. But what I really want to ask about is, it was about 2015, 14 maybe, some Cuban musicians came here. They were from Trinidad in Cuba, which is a very different music than what you're talking about in Havana. And so I'm just reminded or I'm not clear, I guess, the musicians that you're talking about, are they ones that live here, that have come from Cuba and live here? Or are you talking about musicians, did you talk to musicians like these folks from Trinidad who are here with the Playing for Change program? A friend of mine out of Regina had organized.
Mostly.
And just sort of what difference that makes between what people were talking about if they were still based in Cuba.
Most of the people I've interviewed are people in Canada, the Cuban musicians who I've been, Cuban, and I always say Cuban adjacent as well, musicians are people in Canada, and now I could say a fairly, you know, I'm still going. I've still got more places I want to go and people I want to meet, but a fairly good cross section across the country. In terms of where they are from, it really varies. Lots from Havana. You remind me, I've heard that about Trinidad. I've never been there, but I've heard it's a really distinct and wonderful musical culture. And I don't believe I've spoken to anybody from Trinidad who has ended up in Canada. I think that's a random, you know, that's for random reasons. People are from everywhere in Cuba. There's a few musical kind of, you know, centers, but music, as you know, if you've been there, music is everywhere. And the genres are, I guess I would say of the genre, if you thinking of it as genre categorization, lots of jazz musicians and lots of salsa, people in the salsa world. Less trova, less folk, for the obvious reasons of language in Canada.
Okay, I think that brings us to our signing portion of the evening. A big thank you to our guests tonight. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for being here in person and online today. Big thanks again to Between the Lines for the publishing and for the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. Again, thank you, Jorge and Nállim, for hosting. And then another big round of applause for Karen Dubinsky. Thank you so much. So for the signing portion of the evening, that's going to take place right here on my right. Feel free to have a book signed before you pay for it. So long as you visit the cash desk before you leave, we'll be happy with that. But yeah, you're going to start doing that right over here. I'm just going to turn that music on. Thank you again. Have a good one. Thank you.
so much. So Victor,
My husband, Ted, will be here too.